Hi, and welcome to Advanced Topics in Gang Stalking, Mind Control Slaves, and Satanic Ritual Abuse. Today we'll be talking about what are mind control slaves, how they relate to gang stalking, how they are created, and techniques commonly used, how it relates to Satanism, how it relates to other forms of ritual abuse, and giving a comprehensive history in the United States of key personalities, key publications. Mind control programming in terms of trauma-based mind control is actually one of the most provable elements of all of this. So obviously this is all related to the same system that carries out gang stalking. But it's actually one of the most provable. There's been journal publications in Scientific American, the American Journal of Psychology, many kinds of publications that we'll get into in this video. So it's not just, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, but this is actually one of the areas that's it's very well documented. So one thing I want to emphasize is if you believe that there's any chance that you could be a mind control slave, and you have experienced satanic ritual abuse, or you believe that you've had high-level programming installed in you, then I would not recommend watching this video unless you really know what you're doing. Because hearing this information and starting to realize what's going on can induce certain programmed states in you, which can induce suicide programming, which can induce phone home states, etc. So recontact states. So it may be better not to watch this if you are a victim of that, and try to get therapy, contact organizations like survivorship.org, but you also need to be very careful because there's obviously perps running around everywhere, and will have you put away as soon as they can. So this is my second video on this channel. The reason I decided to finally do this video is because, after my last video, I left you with, explaining what happened with Joe and how he was taken away and disappeared. So I decided to, I've still been trying to contact him, etc. for about a year. Suddenly, out of nowhere, I got a letter in the mail stating that I had inherited $1,000 and that he had disappeared. And he'd been killed, basically. Well, they didn't say he'd been killed, but, he was killed. He was healthy, walked miles every day. 1 year later, after they took him, he was dead. So, obviously, and the interesting thing is he had left me over $500,000 in his will. I saw his will, so obviously they altered his will and took me out of it, etc. So it was never about the money to me, but, just the fact they did that to him against his wishes, because he wanted me to have that money because I was his godson, and I was the only child really he ever had. So it was very upsetting to me to know that they got his money. But that motivated me to do this video finally, and to, I even tried to go to his graveside. They must have buried him somewhere else because the plot that he owned is not dug up, which is very strange. And interestingly, I found out through a source that, he was originally at a nursing home, and apparently he was transferred into custody of the VA, which is the Veterans Affairs here in the United States. And if you remember my story from last time, Joe was actually, his targeting and harassment all related back to the military in World War II and events in Okinawa. I'm not going to get into all of that because that's not what this video is about. But just for people that were curious, whatever happened, he is dead now. They got him, and we don't even know where his body is. The plot that we thought where he would be is not, has not been touched. So maybe he's not even dead. Maybe they took him somewhere and disappeared him somewhere or something. So anyways, so now you know that. There's a lot of content I'm going to try to cover. It's been about a year. I've been doing a lot of research. This is one of the areas that I'm very interested in. So anyways, I'd like to just start people off with a definition of what mind control slaves are, in case you're not aware. Mind control slaves is what they call them, which are people who have been subjected to high-level programming, usually installed through ritual abuse, which is a form of trauma-based mind control. And what it is used to do is the ritual and the trauma-based mind control is used to create programmed alters, which are basically alternate personalities, multiple personalities in the back of your consciousness, in the back of your subconscious, I should say, that can be brought to light on cue, usually by a variety of triggers, dates, mental dates that they establish, events in your life can cause these states to come back out, these alters, and they take control of your body. You have no recollection of anything that goes on when you're in one of these alters. There's often numerous alters that are created. Some of them have suicide programming. Some of them have programming from home. So I'll be talking about that. And the reason that this is relevant to gang stalking is many of them are what we call advanced targets, which are targets that need to be, that aren't, the goal isn't to necessarily kill them, but it's necessarily to keep them down in a state of objection so that they can be used for other things. Usually people that are subjects of mind control slavery end up being used for high-level prostitution in government or corporate interest, drug trafficking, it has been revealed, satanic ceremonies. So we'll be talking about that. Let me think of any other thing. Yeah, child sex trafficking, all kind of nasty, nasty stuff. So, so we'll also be talking about what they are and why, like I just said, how they are created and the techniques used. So many of this stuff will be very disturbing. So if you're squeamish, I would recommend not watching this because some of the things are very disturbing. We'll talk about the relationship to Satanism, and then I'll be giving you a comprehensive history of satanic ritual abuse, regular ritual abuse, trauma-based mind control, how it relates to General Valalee, the U.S. Army, how it relates to certain government projects, such as Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, MK, which later, and they both, Project Artichoke later became MKULTRA. So I'll be giving you a comprehensive history, and hopefully you'll have a better understanding of these topics than when you started. So mind control slaves are a small subset of all gang stalking targets. Not everyone who is targeted by gang stalking is a mind control slave. So these are highly purposed targets, picked for some reason. They often have handlers. They often have people in their lives that are controlling them, or at least they have somebody that is watching over them to execute the programming that was installed. Usually, mind control slaves had their programming installed when they were children. Mind control slavery programming usually happens less than 6 years of age. It can happen at any time in life, but normally it is installed, and it is most effective when installed when the person, the victim I should say, is under 6 years of age, because their brain is highly malleable and it is very capable of learning and dissociation. So that is the prime time to install programming, because they just are getting language abilities. Especially very young, they have language abilities, but they have no conscious barrier that later develops. If you can look in the stages of development, they have no conscious barrier yet, so it's very easy to create fragmented states. So these kind of people are used to carry out missions such as assassinations, prostitution, murders. There's some relevance to Girls Town and Boys Town. There's been allegations made against those organizations that they were involved in mind control slavery and ritual abuse, Satanism, all kind of nasty stuff. So related to high-level politicians, Senator Byrd has been implicated, George H.W. Bush, numerous people that we'll be talking about. There's the Manchurian Candidate theory, if you watch the movie The Manchurian Candidate. Mass shootings are commonly believed to have been programmed through mind control slavery and trauma-based mind control. We'll be talking about how they were created in the 50s and 60s through Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, and these are declassified. You can read the documents online. They're very disturbing. Also, projects that are not declassified or are unacknowledged, such as Project MONARCH, which you probably will not find in declassified documents, but which has been discussed by many targets. Project MKULTRA, MKDELTA, MKSearch, and how high-level programming is installed and how this relates to the military. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about how they are created. So basically the way it works is extreme abuse, which children are subjected to. Like I said, though, it can be adults or adolescents. It overwhelms your brain and it creates dissociative states. So we all know that people come back from the military and they have post-traumatic stress disorder after they've experienced something stressful. And the memories trickle up during their dreams, and they have these horrible memories, etc., etc., etc. So basically, it's that same concept, except being exploited. So one way that this is used is subjecting children to ritual abuse, which means repetitive abuse, but it can also be ritual in the sense of ritual as in a religious celebration or a religious sacrament, as in Satanism, which we'll be talking about, which creates, which is very bizarre kind of overwhelming experiences for these children, which cause the children to wall off those memories in an altar in their brain. Altars are basically walled off brain personalities. Those personalities can then be programmed through high-level programming, with techniques such as psychic driving, etc. What psychic driving basically is repeating, maybe tying someone down or locking them in a room and playing a recording maybe for days, thousands of times of a message over and over and over again in their mind until that state, that altar is completely programmed. There's other techniques as well. So anyways, those states, though, also have triggers. Those altars have triggers to be able to get into them. So basically, you can be a normal person. You don't even know that any of this happened. You've forgotten all of that stuff. Usually that's the first layer of programming installed, is to forget all of it. So you don't remember this in your conscious experience. But later on, basically, they install triggers so that somebody can later come up and use the trigger, use a strange word or something to cause you to instantly go back into that state. It can also be self-induced. So it can be if, the trigger is if you start remembering this, go into a different state. So there's all sorts of high-level and advanced programming installed, which can be used to stop you from exposing it. So like I said before, most of the targets are less than 6 years of age. So now I'm going to talk about some of the kinds of torture involved. Many of this happens during satanic ceremonies. We'll be talking later on about what Satanism is. But just right now, all you need to know that sometimes this happens during satanic ceremonies. It has been done in the military, etc. And so if any of these things sound familiar to you, you could be a subject of high-level programming and ritual abuse. And as a reference for this, I'll be using something called the Extreme Abuse Survey, which was a survey conducted over survivors, which talked about the kind of experiences that they remember during their mind control programming. So some of the things that people have experienced include sexual abuse and torture as they were children, being confined in a box, being confined in a coffin. Usually a common technique is to bury a child deep underground with a rubber tube coming up through the ground and just burying them and telling them that they are going to be murdered, burying them alive, basically. Putting a tube up through the air so that and leaving them there for hours, maybe even days, and then somebody from the cult or from the military, if it's, you know, military base, comes and rescues them, and then that causes that person to attach onto them. Also, these techniques are commonly used to bring people into Satanism. It can be used to actually recruit, I don't want to say recruit, but force participation in satanic worship ceremonies, create slaves that participate in the ceremonies, etc. Being restrained with chains, being tied down, drowning people and resuscitating them repeatedly, you know, bringing them close to death as possible and reviving them repeatedly to create, you know, horribly traumatic experiences so that the brain creates an alter, creating extremes of hot and cold, burning them with chemicals, submersion in water, ice water, boiling water, skinning people, skinning large parts of the body which are not visible, tying them in a chair and spinning them for a very long time, subjecting them to flashing light torture, flickering light torture for days on end, sometimes weeks at a time, not allowing them to leave the room, putting them in blinding lights. Blinding lights are interesting because blinding lights can cause your body to, causes your brain to become instantly into a confused state. So oftentimes they'll be tied down, eyelids taped open, and blinding lights used repeatedly along with other torture. Electrical shocks, electrodes on genitals, you know, forced to do it to other people as well as another thing. Forced ingestion of urine, feces, diarrhea, those kinds of things, blood, drinking blood, especially in satanic ceremonies, eating other people, eating flesh, being made to go without food for a very long time, made to stand for a very long time, made to stand in a barn. For some reason that there's this bizarre experience of making people stand in a barn like an animal for days on end, depriving people of sleep for weeks on end, compression with boards. So many times there's this experience where people will be forced to lay down, and they'll put a piece of basically particle board on top of them, and many other people will sit on top of it and crush them basically until that, you know, and repeatedly over and over again, forcing the air out of their lungs, putting them in a sensory deprivation tank for weeks on end, you know, just allowing them to drink, but not allowing them to eat. You know, obviously many of these things are coupled together. Administering drugs such as LSD, intravenously usually, you know, drugs to create amnesia, high overdoses of LSD, high overdoses of DMT are commonly used to create these states. And if anyone doesn't know what DMT is, you can look that up and you'll see its relationship to this. Sometimes even giving people chemotherapy drugs, creating pain and illness through that, having your limbs dislocated repeatedly, having rats tied down and having rats, snakes, spiders crawl over you, centipedes crawling over you or put inside of you. Yeah, like I said, repeatedly resuscitated after drowning over and over again, forced to perform abuse on other people, usually killing animals, disemboweling animals and eating the intestines, drinking blood of animals, disemboweling animals, usually involving some sort of knife is usually involved, not usually with guns because that's too quick, usually involving an animal, disemboweling it and eating the parts of it, consuming it, and in some cases there's something called a birthing ritual, which is commonly performed in satanic ceremonies. We haven't got to Satanism yet. We will talk about it in detail later. But there's something called a birthing ritual used in satanic ceremonies, which basically involves either killing an animal or human and putting a baby or an adult or an adolescent into, you know, slicing the animal open dorsally and inserting the person inside the animal along, you know, obviously it has been some of the guts and intestines have been removed, and inserting it into the animal, the person into the animal, covering them with blood, and forcing them to crawl their way out of the animal, which is what they call a birthing ritual, which basically means that, and they believe that this means that the person has, come out of this sacrifice and into their group. So obviously this is, used in Satanism. And actually some of the people that, as we will see, that are involved in the military are also involved in Satanism. So obviously, there's a, revolving door between the military and satanic groups. So forced participation in prostitution, as we will see, Cathy O'Brien, Kathleen Sullivan, forced participation in child pornography, mutilation of children, sexual mutilation of children, forced to be raped, forced impregnation. The fetus is then eaten. Usually they'll allow the person to carry the baby, and then forced abortion, and then eat the fetus, and force the mother to eat the fetus. The baby is usually, and also can be born and enslaved, sold into child slavery, or sacrificed. Obviously, other forms of abuse, what they call spiritual abuse, forcing the person to feel possessed. There's something called magic surgery, in which they drug you usually, and then when you wake up, there'll be some cuts on your body, and they'll tell you that they've installed devices in you, installed spirits in you, or taken things out of you. And really, usually they didn't do anything. It's just usually a psychological trick to make you feel that something has been done to you. So obviously, desecration of Christian symbols, desecration of cross, Eucharist, things like that, usually mixing them with urine and forcing it, and feces, and forcing people to consume it, convincing them that they're married to Satan, surgery, torture surgery, just while their person is conscious, just to see what's inside of them or take things out. Harm to pets, harm to animals, capturing pets that are on the street, capturing cats, eating them and dismembering them. Also, creating food aversions. Many people who have experienced ritual abuse have been are very sensitive to certain types of food, usually red food, because it's covered, or brown food that's colored like blood or feces. So also let's talk about some other ones. Let's see. So let me go to the extreme abuse survey to see some things in there, which I've picked out. I'm not going to read everything, but just some of it. So being caged, being hypnotized, threatened with death if you ever talked about it. These are people who have recovered memories from the abuse. So something that later happens usually in life around people's 50s or 60s is that the programming starts breaking down sometimes, and the memories start trickling up into conscious states. Usually when this happens, suicide programming is invoked, or the target phones home to their controllers and is either killed, or other things are done to them so that they are discredited. So threatened with death, bestiality is common, blinding lights as we talked about, bondage, brain implants, buried alive, dislocation of limbs, electronic harassment, experiments with dolphins for some reason is very common, forced cannibalism, forced impregnation, forced drugging, forced participation in murder, forced to abuse other victims, forced to be perpetrators of gang stalking, forced to murder, forced to participate in animal mutilations, incest, injection of eye drops, marriage to Satan in satanic rituals, microwaved abuse, murdering a child, experiencing near death, near drowning, non-lethal weapons, pornography, prostitution, psychic driving, As I said, psychic driving is when someone is forced to listen to a recording for days, usually thousands or tens of thousands of times. Radiation exposure, receiving physical abuse, sensory deprivation, sexual abuse, sleep deprivation, spinning, starvation, straitjacketed, use of blood, use of feces, use of urine, witnessing murder, witnessing animal mutilations by knives, witnessing killings, witnessing physical abuse and other abuse. So those are some things that are commonly used. So other kinds of abuse, psychological abuse that are subjected on people is threats against your loved ones, threats to kill you if you ever talk about it, telling people that you are secretly, your family and your loved ones are secretly on the plot, so you're too afraid to tell anybody. We already talked about being confined. Many children are told to practice being dead and buried alive in a coffin. Right, and like I said, then one of the cult members will dig the child up, and then the child feels it's a form of Stockholm syndrome, basically, where the child bonds with the person that has rescued them. Right, confined with animals. Hung upside down for a very long time, being buried, forced to sit in a room with mutilated body parts or a dead body, degradation through verbal abuse, had sexually provocative pictures taken of you, forced production in pornography, so and threats to reveal it if you ever come out, made to feel watched, the feeling of being constantly observed, subjected to mind-altering drugs and mind control, so that you can't remember things. Like I said, magical surgery, birthing rituals. There's also something called a marriage ritual, usually when the person is forced to either marry a cult member, marry a dead animal, marry a dead body, marry Satan himself in a satanic ritual. Compelled to kill other people, compelled to kill human beings, including children, especially children, ingest parts of children, ingest parts of a fetus, drinking blood, especially human blood. So then we'll talk about some more physical abuse, especially, pins and needles inserted to the genital areas, electrical shock, being hung, submerging a person in water, withholding food, we already talked about that, physical beatings, use of forced tattooing, burns, withholding food, cutting off body parts such as digits, cutting off toes, repeated sexual assaults, usually gang rape, forced rape, forced sodomy. Usually sexual things involve symbolic objects such as a crucifix or a wand, weapons including knife or gun, penetration by knife, sexual assault coupled with violence, forced sexual contact with a dead person or a dead animal, forced to have sexual contact with animals, forced to sexually commit acts against children. Right, and so also I'm going to talk about the signs that you have been abused ritually or are the subject of high-level programming and ritual abuse. One of the signs is obviously if you start recovering memories, especially in your 50s or 60s, which is way after the typical onset of schizophrenia. You start having weird memories that start coming back, and many people have no explanation of why, they have intense fears of certain things without any explanation. Or if you start noticing that there's calls that you place that you don't remember placing, a few hours missing out of your day, things like that can be signs of ritual abuse. Many ritual abuse survivors become very hot and cold very easily. They become very upset when seeing babies. Babies aren't enjoyable for them. They find them disturbing. They identify usually with abused animals and abused children. They can become set upon seeing dolls and particular types of animals, usually because, you know, those were involved in their satanic abuse or the ritual abuse. They may have sexual disorders, sexual aversion, be afraid of sex. You know, maybe they also have become sadistic. So, you know, obviously this isn't a one-way street. Some of them actually get sucked themselves into satanic ritual abuse or ritual abuse, and they then become the perpetrators. Again, I want to emphasize that this is not all about Satanism, but it can, a lot of it almost always is related in some way to Satanism because the main key players are related to Satanism. So, right, so many of survivors of ritual abuse are vegetarian because they find meat repulsive, because they were forced to eat and drink blood during their programming. They, by and large, are very spiritual. They believe in, you know, God and the devil and things like that, and they sometimes personally feel possessed. So they may even be afraid of God. And they may be afraid of religion in general, or they may be very religious, so they can swing. Maybe art, you know, drawing pictures, especially children drawing a picture that, you always see in movies. A child is in school and they draw a picture and there's someone dead and mutilated or something like that. So that's obviously a sign of ritual abuse that's percolating up into the conscious mind. But also in you, if you're drawing something and you start to draw and you just draw out a violent picture, it could be a sign of ritual abuse. Creative writing, that you want to write about bloody and ritual abuse, things like that. And, often in people's art, you'll find symbols of it, including knives, frightening, strange figures, people dressed in black, people with horns on, things like that, monstrous figures, coffins, being buried, are common themes in art produced by survivors of high-level programming. Children may start reenacting elements of the torture that they experienced. Like a girl that, was pretending hanging herself and stuff like that because it had been done to her, actually. Thoughts of self-mutilation, the desire to self-mutilate, stabbing and sexually assaulting others, localized pain, including gastrointestinal pain, because people, where you were abused, genitourinary pain, musculoskeletal pain, gastrointestinal, motor inhibitions are very common, nausea, swelling in certain areas, even prior to any visual memory. But prior to the memory actually percolating into your conscious mind, you may actually start to get physical memories back. Fluorescent lighting may be very bothering to you because many types of ritual abuse involve high and bright lighting. Telephone ringing may, for some reason, make you distraught because, as we will talk about in one of the papers by General Valalee, they talk about how just calling somebody and saying one word, when you say hello, they say a word and you're instantly in the trance state. Fear of being spied on. Victims of mind control may say things out of context, like someone starts talking about something, they just start repeating a message, often methodically, like, I want to go home, I want to go home, I want to go home, or saying things that just don't make sense in context, singing things compulsively, saying things compulsively, and like I said, all of these things can occur prior to you having any conscious recollection of the ritual abuse. So there are neurobiological responses to these overwhelming trauma states. So when your brain starts recovering them, or they start coming a little bit into your subconscious mind and coming into your pseudo-conscious mind, then your neurobiological system can also start recovering them. Right, so something else I wanted to mention that I had forgotten before is the concept of the satanic alphabet. Many people who have experienced ritual abuse and satanic ritual abuse will be writing and maybe accidentally write letters backwards, and they don't know why they do it, or writing letters upside down, and they don't know why they're doing that. And actually those letters, they find out later, you will learn that those letters and upside down symbols and such like that are part of the satanic alphabet. So that is a strong sign of satanic ritual abuse. Also, an inversion to holidays like Halloween. Halloween is a high holiday in Satanism. You're being afraid of your birthday, things like that, because these are all events and days which have fundamental importance in Satanism, which we will be talking about because we haven't even discussed Satanism yet. Some people have flashbacks to the abuse, as I said before. Also, I want to talk about what a trance state is, what an alter is. An alter is basically a state which one enters when they are experiencing, your brain creates this state when you're experiencing high-level programming. Some people call it a trance state. It's a dissociative state. There's mental disorders called dissociative personality disorder, obviously, which has a lot to do with this, and obviously which psychologists and psychiatrists use to discredit you. So they can be induced by conditions such as mental exhaustion, terror, repetitive chanting, and drugs. And these trance states can have triggers, as I said before, and triggers are basically events, words, things that happen in your own life, memories, objects, anything basically, songs, which can cause you to instantly enter a trance state or a dissociative state or an alter, whatever you want to call it. And basically then you begin executing the programming. Because as soon as you enter into that alter, you're instantly taken back to the programming that was installed in you at that time. Remember the messages, the psychic driving, etc. So also relating to the trance states and the altered states of consciousness, many people in their 50s and 60s, for some reason, that's a time when your brain starts recovering some of these memories. They start percolating up, start remembering bizarre things, remembering having done illegal things such as killing people in these altered states. Some of them have remembered, doing illegal pornography such as bestiality, kiddie porn, kidnapping children, black marketing children, distributing illegal drugs, smuggling drugs, contract murders, black ops for the government or for companies, torturing people, participating in it themselves, participating in gang stalking willfully, participating in gang stalking in a trance state, enjoying it, sexual blackmail, bombing things, sexual servicing, politicians usually, such as those allegations that have been made against Senator Byrd and others, businessmen, and being prostitutes for law enforcement agencies, planning drugs, being Manchurian candidates, being made to make certain decisions. Many people that are in these states are made to get certain jobs also. So there's this idea of a Manchurian candidate is basically you're programmed and you're made to get a certain job, like a presidency or an important position in a company, sabotaging another company. Then you're forced to, induce programming, and then you carry out their wishes, either making bad decisions, sabotage, etc. High-level cases, so they have, people obviously controlled in high levels of government by this. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the types of states which can be created. Types of alters is another way of saying it. And, the different types of programming. So there's basic programming and more advanced programming. So the most basic programming usually consists of using psychic driving. So I would encourage you to watch a movie called The Sleep Room, which is about Dr. Cameron, which we'll be talking about when I start talking about the history. But psychic driving, as I said like 3 times now, is basically repeating the same message over and over and over again with nothing else, usually no other stimulation. Obviously, this is paired with sensory deprivation. This is also simple programming. Usually the most basic program that is installed in an altar is to never remember. So they will tell them, you will never remember this, you will never remember this, you will never remember this. So also many other things, telling commands that the person has to do, making the person make promises, in the abused state, that, if you ever, go back here again, you will do this, you will do this. So that way, when the person is made to enter that state again, they will remember the promise and execute it, because, usually it's paired with the promise that the torture will stop. More advanced programming involves more advanced torture, usually electroshock, especially to the brain, forced drugging. I'm not going to go through all the things again. Usually that they also can create blackmail, take pictures of you in sexual provocative poses and have that there in case you ever start waking up. So that's, to keep you quiet. Again, many of the people that are involved in the very complex programming are children, usually less than 6 years of age. Very young children, just when they start to be able to understand things and know what's going on, but still don't have the cognitive barrier and are able to be molded and have alters created very easily. So usually they are the most malleable to the advanced programming. So one of the most advanced, in the most advanced programs will have states, alters buried within alters. So basically there could be alters when you go to this building, then there's another altar when you go to this room, and each has its own programmed purpose. So there can be alters which induce suicide programming in certain states. So if you're in this state and remember this, and you get into another altar which causes you to commit suicide, etc. So if you ever, there's alters. More advanced programming has alters basically that if you start remembering certain memories, that you will go into that altar and it will want you to kill yourself, etc. So we'll also be talking about the types of states later. More advanced programming usually has triggers, cues, and codes. So many times these could be numbers, access codes. So when somebody says a number to you, so you answer the phone. That's why many targets of high-level programming will be sitting there and the phone rings and they get very scared because, they don't understand why. Many times people don't even remember any of this that happened, but it's unconscious and it's subconscious. But their body still has that reaction. That can't be taken from your body. The physical reaction to that you jump. It's something, it's like an unconscious reaction. Just like when, your knee gets hit, your leg moves. It's the same kind of response. So, then people answer the phone and they, you say hello, and they meet the person on the other end immediately says a number and you're back in the altered state. So, so the ability, and normally that they have this ability, so later on in life, they can cause you to go back into these states and then update the programs, give you new commands, etc. So the program, many people don't remember any of this, obviously, don't know that any of this is happening. You're living a normal life. You just notice every so often you don't remember some things, or you wake up in a different area, or, you find numbers in your phone which you didn't call, and just some bizarre behavior. Things just don't seem right. There doesn't seem to, there's a gap in your time. So there's even been cases of programmers, of high-level abuse and stuff, overriding other programmers' programming. So basically there's the whole concept of, there's different factions in Satanism and the Temple of Set versus the Church of Satan, etc. And obviously, if they know you're a target of this, they can also try to override your programming, install their own programming in it, and cause you to join their cult, etc., or to perpetrate acts for their cult. As I said, attempting to stop this or to forget it or to go to therapy can cause you to enter a flag state or a self-destructive state, which can cause you to commit suicide, which can cause you to phone home, which can cause you to enter it, and often, usually at that point, you end up becoming a full-on gang-stalking target and discredited and forced to commit suicide, etc. So we talked about indicators already, ritualized behavior, self-mutilation, colors, aversions to certain things, so I'm not going to go over that again. So now I'm going to begin talking about the different types of states, or different types of alters, dissociative alters that are involved in this. So obviously there's tons of pain and torture involved. We'll be talking about later, and I talk about the history of this. The MKULTRA project had a lot to do with this in creating them. In particular, you can see a now declassified document called SI and H experimentation, which, you know, are symbols, but they don't have them defined. So, you know, H usually refers to hypnosis, but basically they talk about in another paper, which is called The Mind Manipulators, which were children were actually programmed to basically, you know, go into these states and set a bomb, basically, and sit in the room next to it. A lot of these states, many people that are victims of this kind of programming have handlers, which basically, so if you ever start remembering anything, these handlers will report it to the satanic group or to the military group or etc. And they basically are there just so if you ever start to wake up, if you ever start to know what was done to you, you will immediately be handled and you will immediately be dealt with. So the two types of states that are commonly present in almost all targets are daytime states, which are basically your normal, everyday, day-to-day state. You know, going to work, you know, cleaning your house, etc. Your normal state. You know, which is basically your day-to-day life. But they also, but they call that the daytime state. Also, there is what's called, in almost all cases, a reporter state, or a phone home state. A phone home state is if you ever start to wake up, or maybe just every once a month. It doesn't even have to be one, if you start to wake up. If you know, once a month, every couple months, you know, a special event, maybe your 18th birthday, your 50th birthday, you call a certain number or you get in touch with a certain person and you report to them what's been going on. So this is what they call the reporter state. And this is why I was saying if you notice there's phone calls that you didn't make in your phone, that can be a good indication that you've been entering a reporter state. And as I said, when you enter these states, you don't remember anything that happened to you. So the idea is that it rats out other states. The reporter state rats out other states in your brain if those states start to recognize themselves or reveal themselves, or just based on certain things that have been pre-programmed, like call me every Tuesday, call me once a month, call me on your 18th birthday, call me if this happens, call me if you get in touch with this person, call me if you learn about this. So reporter states are usually have been programmed to call phone numbers, call to recontact people, to use phone booths. So if you ever just wake up and you're in a phone booth, that's a good indication. Many dissociative states, as we've talked about, have been programmed with cues and triggers. The handlers that are in your life are not necessarily programmers. They could, they're not necessarily the person that installed the programming. They could just be people that are in on it, basically, or being paid, or just, gang stalking perps that are in your life to manage your life. So basically, if you start to wake up, they handle you. So if you're ever in public and somebody, especially if they're not in on it, and somebody says something which is a trigger and you just start acting differently or something, that can be a good indication. A lot of this has, many people that do remember, start recovering memories of this, end up finding out how they were manipulated, so they end up learning the triggers, they end up learning the dictates and jobs that those states were giving to them, and they learn the triggers, basically. So they end up, and they also learn the abuse. They'll start recovering the memory of how they were locked in the room and the torture was done to them, how they were manipulated, etc. Many states believe in the threat of greater harm, so many states are programmed with a threat that they will either be killed or eliminated if they ever end up in conscious thought, if they end up trickling into the daytime state. Many people believe that there's impossible to escape, and like I said, many of these people rely extensively on the callback program or the recontact state to introduce new programming to make people keep feeling helpless. so many of them have gone into, many people have been forced to commit ritualized murder. Many of these people are also feared of electromagnetic surveillance and harassment. Many people have these weird memories of having chips implanted into them, or having their abusers wearing scrubs, doctors that are doing the abuse. So many people are afraid of doctors. And the people that are murdered in these sacrifices, like we've talked about, sacrifices are very important. We haven't talked about why yet because we haven't gotten into the history of Satanism. But many people that are likely to be killed by people are subjects of the highest level of programming and highest level targets that start remembering and start recovering and start revealing what's going on. Suicide programming is usually induced. But for sacrifices, sacrificial purposes and purposes of, abuse for satanic ritual, the most commonly killed are homeless people for obvious reasons, because nobody's going to notice if they're gone. If a homeless person just, a transient just disappears, no one knows where they went, what the hell, so they're commonly abducted, tortured, mutilated, and killed. Children abducted from third world countries, child sex trafficking, sex traffic workers, fetuses, infants that are born, sometimes people, these people make girls not go to hospitals to deliver their baby and force them to deliver the baby in a satanic black mask ceremony, and then the baby is taken out and killed, so they're murdered. We can't, just because they're a baby, they're still murdered. And also people that are born, quote unquote, off the grid. So people that live off the grid, don't have social security numbers, etc. A lot of these states also are given promises of power. Remember, these states can actually fight with each other and conflict in your subconscious. So many states are programmed with promises of power for cooperation. It's not all torture, and as we said, forced induction of Stockholm syndrome, making a state fall in love. They can even make you be in one of your states, be in love with one of your abusers and not want to rat it out for that reason, not want to expose them. So that's another one. So many, this is at the highest level of programming, obviously. Make states fall in love with them, make them be loyal. They convince those states that, the abusers love them, etc. Right. And there's also this, especially in satanic ceremonies, there's also this belief, they install these beliefs into people that they are, that they're possessed by demons, instead of just realizing what's actually happening to them. It's all about keeping you in the dark, keeping you ignorant of what actually was done to you. So make people believe that they're possessed by demons, instead of just realizing that, that they were abused ritually and programmed. Make them believe that they were, possessed by a demon, that they are, they're possessed by Satan, they're a Satanist themselves, etc., or that they're crazy, etc. So many of the states are programmed to actually believe in the ideology of Satanism or the abusers. They can program the states to actually be participants in the ceremonies, in the satanic ceremonies. So many people recover memories of actually participating in this stuff and doing it. So those states have the memory of doing that, and those states feel as if they are a part of the abusers. Those states actually believe that they are the abusers and they are the perpetrators, when in reality they're just programmed sub-states. So that's another type of state. Many states feel unworthy, as we talked about making the states bond with the abusers. Many states feel unworthy unless they are in the company of the abusers, so they want to keep in contact with the abusers. This is commonly used to program those recontact states. Remember, we talked about recontact states, that you contact your abusers periodically. Well, the way they make you do that is sometimes these recontact states, they actually make people fall in love with the abusers, and the recontacts, or to make the state feel make the state feel unappreciated anywhere except in the company of the abusers and the programmers and the handlers. So this way, that state will keep keeping in contact. Obviously, someone that loves somebody will keep in contact with them. So that's a way that those are commonly done. So So now we've concluded our discussion of, you know, how this works, what mind control slaves are, you know, the techniques that are used in creating these states. You know, in summary, we now know that, you know, we have now seen that mind control slaves are people who have gone through extreme abuse, enormous abuse in their lives, and had their mind basically programmed in altered states of consciousness to execute the will of others. So they're not responsible for their actions. They are victims, and we have to remember that. So a perpetrator that's perping you, and it is a mind control slave, you know, you have to remember that they're a victim too, and just keep that into consideration. I believe that many perps, in fact, are mind control slaves, and they don't know what they're doing, and that they're controlled by the highest level. You know, it can actually be that only the very, very, very top have not been programmed themselves. And almost all of these people that are in on this are mind control slaves. You can actually go to work every day and live out this life and do all of this and never actually remember that, and be programmed never to think about what you were doing during the day. It's like that movie, I forget what it is, like The Dark City, where the one guy says, "Don't you notice that it's never night, it's never daytime here? Isn't that strange? When's the last time you remember it being daytime?" You know, and it's just like that. People are programmed not to think about what they were doing during these states. So it obviously connects to gang stalking with many of the people that do this are perps. Many of the people that are perps are mind control slaves. You know, many highest level targets and, you know, very advanced targets are mind control slaves, you know, that are involved in political assassinations, prostitution, etc. So, as you know, obviously, as we get into the history, we'll start seeing somehow this stuff was used. You know, many of them have been involved. Many mind control slaves children have been involved in prostitution for senators and politicians, being made into to do pornography, child pornography. I already mentioned some of this before, but to carry out mass shootings. Many of the people that carry out mass shootings nowadays say they're a victim of mind control. So, you know, and they start discovering it, and it induces suicide programming. So it obviously relates to that. So obviously this whole big system is connected. So I hope you've learned a little bit about what mind control slaves are and how it relates to gang stalking. I'll now be giving you the history of what Satanism is, how it ties in to this, because so far I haven't discussed anything about Satanism. I've just used the word. But now you're going to actually learn what Satanism is, the Church of Satan, and the Temple of Set, which is an offshoot basically. And you're going to be learning high-level figures. I have dates, I have history, I've done a lot of research, so I hope you find that useful. So first I'd like to start off by talking about some government projects that were involved in on this. So everybody knows about, you know, Project MKULTRA. I mean, it's like almost become a hackneyed word now, and it's often misused and abused. But really, that program actually consisted of many sub-projects, and some of them relate to ritual abuse. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about some other government-controlled projects and the people involved in on those projects. Once we're done talking about that, then we'll start going in depth on those people. We'll go into in depth of some prominent survivors of high-level programming and ritual abuse. We'll also be talking about just some other relatively important people that documented some things, etc. So just to point you in some direction in case you want to learn more about this. So first I'm going to start talking about Project Artichoke and Project Bluebird. These are two government projects that were from the 1950s, early 1950s, and some of the documents from Project Artichoke and Bluebird are now declassified. So Artichoke involved the detailed and the creation of amnesia barriers, creating new identities in people, implanting codes to access them and triggers, and hypnotically induced amnesia, basically. So basically they could they were trying to hypnotize people to create these states. But when they say hypnotize, they also mean using trauma-based mind control to induce them. And then once they're in those states, to program them. So if you look at some declassified government documents, which are freely available anywhere on the internet, the Artichoke documents, they're sometimes called. One of them was dated January 7th, 1953. And that document's interesting. And I picked that one because it talks about the creation of multiple personalities in artichoke operations, which, you know, is exactly what ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control is usually about. In which the creation of specific barriers and the hypnotically implanted codes and triggers, which is what I basically just said. Also, there's another document that day that talks about, from January 7th, 1953, that talks about the creation of multiple personalities and 2 19-year-old girls by the CIA. It also, says that the targets can actually be put back into the trance states by telephone, wirelessly, just by receiving a letter in the mail, hand signals, codes, or just words. So basically, they were, in one of the documents, they were talking about how you could just call, like I said, you can call someone and just basically say some words, and they're back in the trance state, and they can receive new programming and orders. So also, it seemed a lot of these projects were, a lot of them, the focus was about trying to use people as information couriers. So basically to create plausible deniability. So basically the idea was to create, to put someone over here that knew a code word, you know the code word, program a target with specific memories, and, details and documents, etc., photographing certain documents, etc. We'll talk about the different levels of mind control, alpha, beta, and theta. Theta mind control often deals, theta programming also often deals with enhancing people's mental abilities to be able to memorize documents, take snapshots, etc. But then what the idea was to have the person, the subject, the survivor, I should say, go in between the two parties, and if captured, and even if you're put on a polygraph test, the people will completely deny it, and you will pass every polygraph test because your personality does not remember. It is the sub-personalities that remember. So that was one thing that was commonly experimented on, and you'll see that as a prevailing theme. And a lot of this was, remember, this is the Cold War era. The ability to communicate information secretly was key. Creation of mind control operatives like this was seen as an asset because, obviously you couldn't be interrogated. Unless you knew the code word, it was basically dead in your mind. Interesting thing that people don't know about Project Artichoke, but people just know Project MKULTRA. Artichoke later was rolled into MKULTRA in 1953 or 1954, and it became one of the 200 sub-projects. MKULTRA was divided itself into 149 different sub-projects. Each of the sub-projects focused on something else. So one of the I forget the number of Project Artichoke, but Project Artichoke was highly connected with mind control and ritual abuse. Now, MKUltra had other things that were related to mind control, such as dosing people with LSD to try and get them to remember. But in those instances, I hesitate to call it ritual abuse or trauma-based mind control, because it seemed more that the thing there was to see if they could just be suggested. Whereas ritual abuse, as I use it, seems to be more of a repetitive, over and over and over again, kind of beating it into you, kind of forcing you into abjection and a state of complete dissociation to program it. Whereas the CIA was trying to experiment with LSD to see how that made people talk, how that influenced their suggestibility, etc., to make people, give someone LSD and try to make them do something. Well, that doesn't seem to me as much like ritual abuse as what I've described earlier. So Project Bluebird was also the same, essentially, as Project Artichoke. Although its focus was slightly different, with instead of being about couriers, it was about some other things, and there were just some other details. But it's not really relevant, though. So one of the doctors that I want to talk about that was involved in these projects, especially the government projects, was Dr. Cameron. And I talked about the video, the sleep room, earlier, about how he was using the psychic driving technique to program people's minds. And it's in a video that you can watch anywhere. Just look up the sleep room, and you can see it. But Dr. Cameron worked at the Brandon Mental Hospital in the 1930s, and of his wonderful record, he was forcing patients to lie naked in lights, and he had basically lights beaming down on these people and making them lie naked for approximately 8 to 12 hours per day for as long as 8 months to a year. So he was basically making people lie naked with lights beaming on them all day. Some of them were not able to close their eyes, and just forcing them to lie there as red lights and lights flickered. As again, we talk about blinking lights, bright lights, because it creates that sense. And these are in adults, remember, not children. Not children under age 6, I should say. Because it's much harder in an adult sometimes to create a dissociative state. So in this case, that's what he was trying to do. Another one of his wonderful experiments involved putting patients in electrified metal cages and shocking them repeatedly over and over and over again until their body temperatures reached 102 degrees. And if you don't believe all this and think this is all hodgepodge, then you can look up the American Journal of Psychiatry, which is a peer-reviewed publication. It's one of the top in the field. It still is to this day. And you can look up Dr. Cameron and some of his wonderful publications that he's published about this, and his experiments on these people, and how he was claiming that this is going to be used. See, his whole claim here was that he was going to be able to use this stuff to train, away schizophrenic behavior. So basically his idea was he could create a dissociative state and put somebody in it, because he believes their normal state, their quote-unquote daytime state, was corrupted by schizophrenia. So the idea was create a new brain state, which could be programmed to exhibit normative behaviors and not exhibit the schizophrenic behaviors exhibited in the normal state. But still, it was mind control, it was ritual abuse, obviously ritual abuse. And he used psychic driving on many of his subjects or patients. I hate using the word patient. So in his psychic driving, though, was kind of interesting because I'll get into a little bit more depth of this now. He broke his psychic driving component. Again, like I said, the psychic driving is repetitive words over and over again, repetitive messages played to you, usually in a state of, what do they call it? Like a sensory deprivation environment or a sensory overload environment. So either you're like in a sensory deprivation tank where everything is black and you're floating in water and you can't touch anything, or on the other hand, your senses are all overloaded. You have lights in your eyes, you're feeling intense pain all over your body, you're being drugged, you're mentally out of it, and so basically every aspect of your psyche and personality, you're being pricked, you're being burned, you're being frozen at this, just to create an overload. And what he called this is depatterning. So in the first stage of his psychic driving technique, people were, forced to go through this trauma called depatterning. And what he used, he basically reduced them to a vegetative state through repeated combinations of shock therapy, usually to the temples, sleep, abuse, like I said, beaming lights on people's, sensory isolation, sensory overload. And basically when people are completely depattern, they're incapable of any control. So basically they were unable to control their bowels, unable to control urine and feces. Unable to feed themselves, unable to say their own name, basically, because you've been overwhelmed to the point of basically being in complete shock. Almost, like when people pass out. It's basically passing out. It's a good analogy. It's basically your mind passes out, but you're still awake, and you wall off the state. You can't pass out because you're not able to, because you're being forced to be awake in many cases. And again, if you want to deny this, it's on record that Cameron received grants from government agencies, from 1961 and 1964, and the grant was called A Study of Factors Which Promote or Retard Change in Individuals Exposed to Prolonged Repetition of Verbal Signal. So this is obviously talking about psychic driving. And this is the study, basically, that funded all of this torture. One of them, obviously. So he's a big player. If you do any research, you'll find his name mentioned in a ton of books. How he was related to other mind control programs, how his research was used by other practitioners, I should say, of this, such as Michael Aquino, but also how he directly participated in it himself. So we're going to talk about Dr. Estabrooks as well. He's a big player. If you do any research, you'll see this name thrown around. He did his work in the 1954 era. He was one of the few doctors. In fact, I think he may have been only one of the actual medical doctors that acknowledged that he was involved in the creation of Manchurian candidates. Again, Manchurian candidates are people who are basically mind control slaves that are specialized, that are developed from a very early age, from their, less than 6 years old, with a purpose already in mind. So if you're going to be the president, it's decided before you're 6 years old, and your mind control, you're experiencing ritual abuse, mind control programming, etc. And then, throughout your life, you grow up, lead a pretty normal life, do everything. Maybe at periods, programming is invoked, so you're very high functioning, so you attain what you need to accomplish that goal. Once you're in that position of power, then the perpetrators of this can use your position and just use you as a figurehead, use that position to accomplish their goals. So they basically just will, use triggers and cues, etc., to invoke programming, and then make you execute their actions and their desires. So with Dr. Estabrooks, he talked about how the Manchurian candidates were created. He talked about explicitly creating multiple personalities, multiple alters in people, which were walled-off personality states, which could be programmed. He talks about how he did this for military purposes. Military was very interested in this at the time, how they funded his research. He refers to them in his work as super spies. But I thought with Dr. Estabrooks that it was very interesting because in his book, he actually talks about how he justifies all this by saying basically in times of war, it's basically justified because, the end justifies the means. We need to have these psychic couriers. We need to have all this kind of stuff because if we don't have it, the Soviet Union will overtake us, etc. Nonsense. So he also talked about the creation of hypnotic couriers. If you look up Science Digest from 1971, he talks about creating hypnotic couriers. Again, this is the technical name given to people who have been programmed with these states and who have been designed to, and programmed in with theta-based mind programming to remember documents, to take basically mental pictures of documents, to infiltrate positions and remember things, and to come back and be basically debriefed. Those personality states debriefed. And this is all publicly acknowledged in 1971 in the Science Digest. So anyone who just claims that this is just the fringe and, you know, that this is just people making this up, give me a break. So perhaps the most insidious of all of these people, and where it ties into Satanism, is the wonderful Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. Colonel Michael Aquino was of psychological warfare operations in the he was in the United States Army from 1968 to 1990. He was a psyops expert, a psychological warfare specialist for the Army. Documented that he worked in mind control operations. You know, Colonel Aquino was later discharged in the, you know, I said he worked in 1990. He was discharged in 1990. I'm trying to remember the story. He was discharged in 1990 because of allegations of sexual abuse against him. Obviously, it had gone on for decades and decades and decades, as we'll get into. But in 1990, it finally just got so much to light, and the military just finally just had enough. Like, it was starting to come out that he even was thrown out. It has to do with he has to do with the Satanic Panic. If anyone remembers the Satanic Panic in the 1980s, obviously he was a key player in this. The Satanic Panic we'll get into was basically, when, just for a little preview, was when people were claiming all over the United States that their children were being abducted in daycare centers, and, you know, had satanic rituals and mind control programming forced on them. And Michael Aquino was involved in the Presidio Daycare Center in San Francisco, where he allegedly, you know, many people came forward saying that he had abused them. He joined Tom LaVey's Church of Satan in 1969. Excuse me, Anton Lavey. Anton Lavey was the founder of the Church of Satan. He stayed in the Church of Satan until 1975, and I guess that he didn't find that it was dark enough for him, so he went off, broke from the Church of Satan to found what's called the Temple of Set. The Temple of Set is basically an offshoot of the Church of Satan, which has, which is still in existence today, and so is the Church of Satan, which basically emphasizes, it has many of the ideals of the Church of Satan, but it also has a kind of a spiritual component. They believe in a creature called Set, which is basically some kind of god-like creature, which they believe, they don't believe in traditional Jesus and Satan roles. They believe in what they call Set, which is the oldest god, they claim, pre-Egyptian god, basically. And it's very old, and they believe that, you know, they go into the mythology of all of this. And their followers are called Setians. And Michael Aquino was the founder and high priest of the Church of Satan, excuse me, of the Temple of Set. Anton Lavey was the founder of the Church of Satan. Anton Lavey also wrote the Satanic Bible. So now I'll give you a brief overview of Satanism, basically, to explain why it relates and why its ideals are often, why Satanism often is brought up in the context of ritual abuse. Because as I've described ritual abuse, you know, it's just horrible, but what does that have to do with Satanism in this belief system? To understand that element of it, you need to understand the ideals of Satanism. So, the basic premise of Satanism isn't necessarily... Anton Lavey founded Satanism knowing that... Let's see if I talk about this, if I have more on this later. I don't. Anton Lavey founded the Church of Satan knowing that... He called it Satanism because he knew that, you know, it would garner a lot of press, and people react to that word. But actually, Satanism is very atheistic, actually. And and really doesn't, most of what I've read about Satanism, they don't, in the Church of Satan anyways, really, they don't believe in any sort of supernatural anything. They don't believe in God, really. They don't believe in anything like that. They believe only in the naturalistic world. So why is it called the Church of Satan? It's basically just the idea that, you know, Satan's fundamental sin in the Bible was that he rebelled against God and he made himself God. He made himself out to be the God. He made himself to have power. And in Satanism, Satanists believe that they actually are basically in complete control of their own destiny, and that they are themselves gods. That they believe that, for instance, if you watch interviews with Satanists, you'll see many of them will say basically that, you know, they were actually present before they were born, and they caused their parents to come together and cause them to be born because they're so perfect, and only their willpower. So a fundamental thing in the Church of Satan is making the ability to control other people and to get what you want. So getting what you want and basically manipulating other people, and the ability to do this is a fundamental part of Satanism. Also, the Temple of Set as well. Satanism. They also talk about they have rituals in Satanism, what they call the Black Mass or the Dark Mass, Satanic Mass, which basically is a ceremony, basically a ritual ceremony. Where many strange things are reported to happen. Obviously, this is where a lot of ritual abuse happens, drinking blood, because they believe that through these ceremonies they can empower themselves and others to effectuate their change in the world. They believe, in the use of deception, propaganda, lying, misinformation, and disinformation. Remember, there's a big difference between mis and dis. Misdirection, confusing people, isolating people, and revisionism. So basically, Michael Aquino was in the Church of Satan. I guess he found that it was not dark enough for him, and it was too atheistic for him, so he founded the Temple of Set. Basically it carries along many of the things from Satanism into it, but it also adds a darker, deeper, more spiritual component, which is with bizarre symbolism. If you look at some of the symbolism, it's very disturbing and highly, I guess disturbing is the best word for it. But anyways, it's upside down crosses, things like that. In terms of the Church of Satan, I know many of them don't believe in Jesus. That was a God. Don't believe, but actually many of them do believe that, Jesus was actually what he did was actually a satanic ritual, is what they believe. They believe that the drinking of blood, how in Catholic Church they say, you're drinking blood when it's wine, and the Eucharist is eating the body of Christ. They believe, that's a very kind of satanic symbol because they believe in eating the body literally and drinking blood literally. So they believe actually they reframe what Jesus was all about into, they make that as actually a black mass. They say that Jesus actually did a satanic ritual when he did all of these things. And he is still being remembered today, so they believe he was one of the greatest practitioners of Satanism, but they don't actually believe he was any sort of god or anything. It's very important because many, especially with the daycare centers and Michael Aquino in the Army, you have to remember it's critical, as I've emphasized in this video, that many victims, it happens under the age of 6, because when the mind is most malleable and susceptible to this. So that's why many daycare centers were initially complaining of ritual abuse, etc. So Now I'll give you a little bit of a history of Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino was also involved in the Phoenix program, if you don't know what that is. So in 1967, Michael Aquino went to Vietnam for the Vietnam War, and he was as part of the Phoenix program. And basically, the Phoenix program, Program Phoenix, was another CIA project, basically, which was a terrorize, assassinate, and torture operation that was supposed to neutralize the civilian population in Vietnam, basically. And it was supposed to neutralize the civilian infrastructure in Vietnam that supported the Viet Cong in South Vietnam. So they were basically trying to infiltrate civilian structures with the Phoenix program. So some of the orders given, and it was basically a mind control operation, etc., just like all the stuff they do. So orders were given to kill key military personnel that were considered high-level security risks, other kind of things, sometimes killing U.S. soldiers. So it wasn't just the Vietnamese. It was also Vietnam soldiers that were subject to this. It's interesting that many of the soldiers involved in this program later, and when they left the military, ended up working and going into Satanism, especially the Temple of Set, as founded by Aquino. Interestingly enough, and this is something I find really interesting, is after they started coming home, people that were involved in the Phoenix program started coming home. Many of them were so demented by this experience that we had all the bizarre behavior of the soldiers coming home from Vietnam. And isn't it strange that after the horrors of World War II, we didn't get all that behavior that we had when those people were coming home from Vietnam? And interestingly enough, there was a lot of, after they started coming home, there started to be a lot of satanic murders, horrible serial murders, satanic undertones, satanic symbolism, especially the Zodiac killer. Interestingly enough, it was often in the Southern California area, in California, in that area. Interestingly enough, that's where Michael Aquino lived. So just look into the Zodiac killer and tell me if those don't look like satanic symbols. So in 1980, Cathy O'Brien, who is a person we'll talk about later. I believe I have a whole thing on her. We'll talk about Cathy O'Brien a little bit more. This is when how she relates to Michael Aquino. She claimed in 1980 that she was programmed and she was subjected to ritual abuse at Fort Campbell in Kentucky by Michael Aquino of the U.S. Army. And by the way, I want to point out that a lot of these claims that are made against him are made by people that have never talked and had no way of knowing each other. So you put two and two together. She claimed that she was programmed by Colonel Aquino. Some people just said I was programmed by the colonel or the colonel. Depends where you're from, I guess, how you pronounce it. But so she believed that she was what they call the presidential model. She discussed the classes of mind control, slave. There's the presidential model, which is used for high-level politicians as sex slave. Cathy O'Brien was used as in Project Monarch as a sex slave. She was programmed to cater to high-level politicians in the United States, essentially, and to keep it quiet. And interestingly enough, she's accused many of these people, and she's never gotten a defamation lawsuit or anything. So that's interesting as well.
There was no place for it in my mind to deal with such horror. Therefore, I developed a compartment in my brain, a little area behind amnesic barriers that was actually the neuron pathway shutting down in my brain in order to compartmentalize the memory of the abuse so that the rest of my mind could function normally as though nothing had happened. I was a chosen one or a prime candidate for mind control because of the sexual abuse that I had endured. My sexuality had been enhanced. Therefore, I was used as a sex slave and also delivered messages to and from these government leaders. And they subjected me to an occult blood ritual. This was so horrific. It was this reversal of the Catholic Mass. It confused my mind because when a person's operating on a subconscious level because they're so traumatized that consciously there's no place for what they're enduring, the subconscious mind has no ability to discern and to question and to reason the same way that the conscious mind does. And this reversal of the Catholic Mass into occultism just made it all seem to run together in my mind. It was absolutely horrific. This blood ritual was so horrible that my mind readily accepted the mind manipulation that I endured afterwards, a hypnotic language, the neuro-linguistic programming, mind control programming, that actually changed the way that my brain was functioning. Occultism is oftentimes used as a trauma base for mind control. Who can comprehend that kind of a trauma? A blood ritual is absolutely horrible, and it's a perfect trauma base for mind control, for the compartmentalization of memory.
In 1982, September 5th, 1982, actually, there was a 12-year-old boy named Mr. Gosch, Gosch, and he was in Des Moines, Iowa, and he was abducted from a shopping parking lot, essentially. And we'll talk more about Ted Gunderson later, who was an ex-FBI agent. But basically that Ted Gunderson interviewed somebody named Paul Bonacci, I think, and who was a programmed mind control slave. And he actually admitted that as a mind control slave, he was, forced to go through ritual abuse, etc. But he admitted to abducting John Gosch, the 12-year-old boy, and abducting him from the parking lot. And he said that he was, used for basically sex work in the government, essentially. And Mr. Bonacci said that Colonel Aquino had essentially ordered this. He was his basically his programmer was Michael Aquino, Bonacci. So he had this memory. He had recovered a memory of abducting John Gosch, and basically, of how that kid was sold into sex work. So that's another implication of Michael Aquino in all of this. So in 1985, this is where it started to break at the in Fort Bragg. There was it's a military installation, and but there at that location was a what's called the Jubilation Daycare Center. A lot of military people left their children there. It's it's for military families essentially. And many children were reported as being sexually abused. Unfortunately for Michael Aquino, he was later identified as being present at that daycare center. And again, it's in the military, obviously, military involvement. Throughout history, you will see a trend of people, especially at the hospital, a lot of claims from the Naval Hospital in Bethesda, Maryland. A lot of families of military people end up being subjected to unfortunately, government experimentation at the military bases and military hospitals, because, of course, that's the easiest place to conduct it at. In 1986, again, more allegations emerged resolving, in the Presidio Daycare Center in San Francisco. So remember, I already talked about the Presidio Center, which was where Michael Aquino was. But that's when it came to public light in 1986. The allegations emerged. 60 victims, 60 victims at the Presidio Daycare Center in San Francisco with Michael Aquino. 60 victims. Oh, and guess what ages? All of them between the ages of 3 and 7. So some of the victims of the sexual abuse were able to positively identify Michael Aquino, Colonel Aquino, basically. He was able to point him out and say, that's who did it to me. A few victims were able to identify at Michael Aquino's home and were able to describe with detail the inside of the home and the satanic interior of the house. And the torture that these children experienced at the Presidio Daycare Center, at the Presidio Child Development Center in San Francisco, was being forced to ingest urine and feces with upside down crosses, being urinated and defecated on by Michael Aquino. There was medical evidence to show that the children were sexually abused. Some of the children as young as 3 years old had contracted chlamydia, which is, chlamydia is some sort of I think it's a protist. It might not be bacteria. I think it's a protist. But it's basically some kind of microscopic organism that that's some sort of STD, basically. But it's like one of the STDs that you can't get like from a blood transfusion. It's like you have to have sexual contact to get it. It's actually very rare, I think. They should, there was clear signs of genital trauma, anal trauma, from crosses, etc., that was consistent with violent, repeated ritual penetration. 60 victims. Michael Aquino had one legal case, but never was held accountable for this. And we'll get into some other people who tried at Child Protective Services and later was forced into the gang stalking system, essentially. So that will come later. We'll talk about that person. In 1987, right at 1 year after the Presidio Daycare incident, a search warrant was served on the residence of Michael Aquino. Basically they got a search warrant against his house, and they recovered many photographs, photo albums, negatives of pictures, tapes, books, address books, and they found in his home, obviously they found all the satanic symbols, but they found a soundproof room which was retrofitted as a torture chamber. Remember, he never went to jail, never did anything for all of the abuse. In November, a couple months after that, the U.S. Army began receiving allegations of child abuse at 15, you can't, I guess, 15 of its daycare centers and elementary schools. Again, the U.S. Army has its own kind of little schools and daycare centers for people in the military, obviously. So there were other, cases. Mostly, remember, Michael Aquino was in the Army, but there were, so almost all of the allegations concerned the U.S. Army. But there were also 2 or 3 daycare centers connected with the U.S. Air Force, and at least one center with the Navy. Again, the same kind of repetitive accusations: satanic acts, animal dismemberment, cult-like behavior, basically. I'm not going to run through it all again, what was going on, but it's the same kind of story. Almost all the victims are very young and reporting the same kind of bizarre behavior that had been reported. It's being reported concomitantly by all of the people across the country who had never spoken. And most of them identifying Colonel Aquino. In 1988, of course they're not going to punish him though, because he was instrumental in developing the program, and he still runs it. Not to mention, you don't think that the people and the politicians and the people who use his sex slaves, who use the mind control slaves, you don't think Michael Aquino has blackmail evidence of them? Come on, don't be that naive. They have blackmail evidence on them. They could blackmail every one of those politicians in Washington. So don't, maybe not everyone, but seriously. Women, men, everything. You should see some of the people. It's disgusting. They don't even deny it. So, in 1988 in November, this is where we start getting into Lawrence King and the credit union. So basically in 1988, I'm sorry, I have a headache, so I keep touching my face. But the FBI raided this credit union, which was basically being scammed in Omaha. Oh no, Omaha, Nebraska, by a man named Lawrence King, and basically he was, running this credit union there, skimming money basically from donors, funneling it into satanic organizations, but also when they did that search warrant, they uncovered evidence related to drug running, as we talked about before, pedophilia, pornography, child sex slavery, child trafficking, human trafficking, satanic activity involving prominent local individuals and government officials. Much of this was later destroyed and discredited. Obviously, you can look up all this new stuff, and I'm just giving you a very watered-down rundown of this. But just to get you interested and to pique your interest for things you might want to research yourself. Obviously, if you hear something I say, research it if you're interested. So many of the children involved in this, described many sacrifices involving animal sacrifice, human sacrifice, eating babies. Many of the children from the daycare centers described killing animals and being forced to mutilate animals, drink blood, etc. A lot of evidence started surfacing showing children were being abducted from shopping malls, and then later children were being auctioned off in Las Vegas and Toronto, Canada. Also implicated was the DEA. The DEA was involved with targets and mind control slaves and running drugs. The airplanes owned by the DEA not only just ran drugs, they were also used to traffic mind control slaves that are children's, especially from Girls Town and Boys Town. So there were allegations that the DEA planes were actually taking children from Girls Town and Boys Town and transporting them to Washington because it's not far away, and using, and basically Girls Town and Boys Town was basically a concentration camp for the prostitutes of Washington. They had little children that they were using as prostitutes, and they were all mind controlled so that they went along with it. Not voluntarily, of course, but, voluntarily in that altered state. Children were, children were taken from orphanages and foster homes like Girls and Boys Town. They participated in sex orgies, group sex with children, congressmen, government, high-level power people, diplomats, and also corporate interests. Let's not forget that. The military-industrial complex is very powerful. Right, so there was some evidence to show that photographs were taken during some of these child sex orgies, showing politicians involved in them to blackmail them later on. So basically it was to, if the politicians ever came out, and started trying to crucify Aquino and his clan and the Satanists, they had all the evidence they need to shut them up. So because if you're going down, I'm going down, if I'm going down, you're going down with me. They're just so damn disgusting. I mean, when you think about all the shit that these people have done, I mean, interestingly enough, one of the victims, which I found interesting, there was a victim named Alicia Owen, maybe, and she was the one woman who spent the longest time in history in the Nebraska prison system in solitary confinement. She spent more time in solitary confinement, Alicia Owen, than any other person in the Nebraska prison system. Do you know what her crime was? Not murder, not, child abuse, etc. Her crime was she allegedly committed perjury. She was sentenced to 9 to 25 years for committing perjury and then put into solitary confinement so she couldn't tell anybody. And basically for testifying that she was a victim in ritual abuse and Satanism, and that she had been programmed, etc. And of course, they wanted her silence, and it was setting an example at the time. You have to remember, it was a different culture, no internet. It was setting an example for slaves and targets who were thinking about coming out and making it public and starting to recover memories. You have to remember, now some of these people were starting to grow up. In adulthood, some of these memories start to break down, especially as you get older, and they start to percolate through. She received a 10 years longer sentence than was given to Lawrence King for taking $40 million out of the credit system and scamming it and laundering it to these shady organizations. Gary Caradori was an investigator who was working with several high-level senators in Washington, D.C. to expose the Satanism trend in America. Because remember, this was during the Satanic Panic, which we haven't really talked about yet. But he was trying to deliver some evidence to some of these senators and stuff, and he was on a private plane which mysteriously exploded and blew up mid-air while delivering evidence of satanic ritual abuse to Senator Schmidt, Loran Schmidt. And basically, this is not just like, speculation. Actually, the Discovery Channel even made a documentary about this called The Conspiracy of Silence. But basically, a group of congressmen paid the Discovery Channel $500,000 to not air the documentary. The Conspiracy of Silence, look it up. So it was basically silence. The Conspiracy of Silence was silence. All the copies of it were destroyed, except one copy. Also, a book was written about this, about killing Gary Caradori, blowing up his plane. It was called The Franklin Cover-Up, written by John DeCamp. Another good read. In 1989, in May of 1989, remember before we were talking about, we were in 1988. Now we're in 1989 in May. Colonel Aquino was again questioned because of new allegations concerning child sex abuse. Like 10 children in 3 cities from all around the country were making accusations and positively identifying Michael Aquino as the perpetrator of the crimes. Because remember, sometimes, not always, but sometimes the programming breaks down and sometimes things start trickling up through. So not all of the programming is successful. I mean, come on, nothing is perfect in this world, even for perpetrators and, programmers. Nothing is perfect, trust me. And, basically, even for them, sometimes the programming breaks down and people start remembering things way too early. And when that started happening, there was a big scandal. And, obviously the tactics got more severe and more refined. So people wouldn't remember. So, obviously that's, we started to see, if you look at the research, that the trend around this time was that the tactics do get severe, the trauma-based control tactics that are inflicted on people do get more severe as time goes on, usually, because, they learned precisely how to do it. There's also some evidence to suggest that, they were experimenting with chemical ways of doing it, not trauma-based. I've read some things where LSD is used. There's also, I've even read, like, where there was one document I read where basically using synthesized mold. You know, LSD is essentially synthesized mold of some sort. But basically, by even implanting this mold or exposing people to, you know, mold is very deleterious on your body. It can destroy your organs. Black mold can kill you, etc. But by exposing people to certain types of mold, they even become more suggestible. I read there was one report about that. So Michael Aquino in 1989 was again questioned. You know, in this case, the children involved were looking at a TV, remember, all across the country, no connection to them, were just watching television and saw Michael Aquino on TV and recognized him. And it brought back, that was enough to bring back those memories as the programmer. There's your programmer on TV being accused of ritual abuse. And so it was they were able to bring back those memories. They you know, and I positively identified him. They were from Ukiah, Santa Rosa, and Fort Bragg, all military areas. Again, then in 1999, Mr. Bonacci or Bonucci, or however you want to pronounce it, you know, was one of the people who was kept as a sex slave, as a mind control slave by Lawrence King. Remember, Lawrence King was the one who had the scam the bank, basically scam the credit union, and was funneling money into the Church of Satan. And Paul Bonacci was one of his sex slaves. And in 1999, he was able to identify Colonel Aquino as his programmer and as an associate of Lawrence King. So he was able not just to identify Michael Aquino as a programmer, but also identify Michael Aquino in connection with Lawrence King, who went to prison for scamming the bank and was caught with all kind of, you know, bizarre materials relating to Satanism. You know, and Bonacci was able to link Michael Aquino and Lawrence King to all kind of, you know, nasty shit back in the day. The Iran-Contra affair, you know, how mind control slaves were used to try in Iran-Contra to provide, you know, I don't remember, it was a little bit before my time, but, you know, how to provide those guns to, you know, in the Iran-Contra affair, in the cocaine trafficking operation. And actually, it even related to Oliver North. I mean, he was able to identify Oliver North before that was even a household name, and he implicated George Bush, George H.W. Bush, and Paul Bonacci. And in the Iran-Contra, right. So in 1990, August 31st, 1990, Colonel Michael Aquino was finally kicked out of the Army, like I said, because finally, I guess they just couldn't deal with it anymore. You know, there were so many allegations from all around the country that finally they just said that, you know, he was terminated from the Army. And he was being investigated at that time in the Army for satanic, child sexual, and ritual abuse. And the Army Criminal Investigative Division, which is called the ACID, ACID, with the Army Criminal Investigative Division, he was investigated for, quote, indecent acts with a child, satanic sodomy, conspiracy, kidnapping, and false swearing. Michael Aquino did not one day in jail. All of that, he did not do one day in jail. There were several cases, but never went to jail. Never got convicted. Everything swept under a rug. Why do you think that is? If we take it back to the modern era, Penn State scandal, you have a lot of people who are together at the same location, one location. So, you know, it's when you have an incident that's all over the country for people that have never talked to each other, their allegations, you know, and their allegations are similar, and they're identifying the same person, their allegations have a lot more weight. But when you have somebody that's like at one location and the people have had a chance to talk, you know, people start repeating what other people have said, for instance, you know, like, that's why in a court case you have to separate the witnesses, because one witness knows what the other witness said. So, you know, at Penn State recently, we had, you know, at Penn State, you know, the Northeast United States, there's been a few sex abuse cases now in the United States. We here in the United States have just dealt with, a huge investigation of college people. Just allegedly some guy, some coach touched them or something in a shower like 30 years ago or something. And they investigated that. But they don't what they don't investigate, well, they do investigate, but it's swept under a rug, is, countless people from all over the country identifying one or two people and identifying Satanism and just sweeping it under a rug. It just never ends, it just never ends. So now I'm going to start talking about how they discredit this. In 1992, something was created called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. And the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is basically what they use to discredit people who claim that they are recovering memories from ritual abuse and other types of, experimentation, human experimentation, etc. Obviously, this isn't just related to mind control. There's, False Memory Syndrome Foundation is also used to discredit people who claim that they've been experimented on, etc. So basically, the false memory syndrome discredits memories of people who claim that they, were traumatically abused as children. And so the way that they do this is the False Memory Syndrome Foundation claims that people recover these memories by saying, don't actually recover them, and they're not actually memories. That the therapist that they go to has implanted the false memories in them. And they also, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation has also been involved in protecting pedophiles, protecting Michael Aquino. They have legal teams that fight, and enter appearances in court and, argue that recovered memories aren't real. And people are very shady involved in it, which I'll talk about. But, so their claim is basically that when you go to a certain therapists actually know about this and they're implanting them in the memories in. So the claim was that during the Satanic Panic, basically, children were going to therapists and the therapist was convincing the child to say these things. And then, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation tries to get the people to recant. It's like crazy. They try to make them recant their testimony, etc., and try to make them crazy. And they have defended people. They defend known pedophiles. It was founded by Peter and Pamela Freyd, F-R-E-Y-D. They established it in 1992. And the reason they established it was because they were accused of sex abuse and ritual abuse by their daughter. So they created the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to discredit people who come forward claiming ritual abuse and sex abuse and all the other things. Interestingly enough, the original board members of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation had people sitting on the panel that were involved in MKULTRA, including Martin Orne and Dr. West. As well as other people that had been previously accused of sex abuse at the time. Sexual abuse of children, some formally charged in court. Richard Offsch, he was the False Memory Syndrome's expert on persuasion techniques. And he was the one who came up with this idea of saying, people go to therapists and recover these memories are implanted. Then there was Margaret Singer. She was a government expert on Satanism and satanic tactics and cults. And they also had Miss Elizabeth Loftus, who was an expert in cognitive memory, essentially. And they used all of these people's skills to come up with this program to discredit people. But the interesting thing is, many people started recovering memories without going to a therapist. So how do you explain that? Because the claim, again, is that people go to therapists who implant memories in them. Many of the people involved in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation have ties to Michael Aquino, or have conducted mind control experiments. Doctors have conducted mind control experiments or in there trying to discredit people in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. So again, it's been used to cover for Aquino and his allies and pedophiles, essentially. So if you ever hear that mentioned, that's what that's about. I'll tell you, these people are so damn obnoxious. It's just, they do think of everything. I'll give them that. In 1995, there was a woman named Diana Napoli, maybe Napolis. She worked for Child Protective Services in Southern California. And basically, as a Child Protective Services investigator, she was actually doing her job, and she was investigating the accusations against Michael Aquino and others in his cult. So she went undercover. I don't remember the whole story, but she basically went undercover online and she came up with a fake persona as she approached Aquino, and she was trying to get Aquino to agree to certain things, and basically Aquino and his cult traced her for 5 years, and finally were able to track her down and found out her true identity. She was trying to expose his involvement in the crimes. She ended up eventually being forced into the gang stalking system. She began being targeted with directed energy weapons, V2K, infrasound, and other weapons. And she was made to look mentally unstable, basically to discredit her. So nothing that she said would have any weight. Unfortunately, she ended up spending a year in jail and put into a mental facility and forced to quit her job, thanks to Michael Aquino, and the targeting of the gang stalking system made her look completely and utterly bonkers. On February 5th, 1999, in Lincoln, Nebraska, Paul Bonacci, which we talked about before, remember Paul Bonacci was the one who was a mind control slave, who admitted to abducting Johnny Ghosh from the mall parking lot and selling him into sex slavery at the behest of Lawrence King. In 1999, he sued Lawrence King, and there was a lot of testimony that was very important in that case. He got a lot of testimony out. He connected Michael Aquino with Anton Lavey in the court. He actually won. This is one of the few cases you can actually see a victory. Judge Warren K. Erbaum ordered Lawrence King to pay $1 million to Paul Bonacci. So actually, it was finally proven in one case. We finally got, any gang stalking survivor knows that the courts are completely controlled, and it's basically impossible to do anything through the court system. I don't know if that was later overturned or not, but he won $1 million because of what Lawrence King had done to him. Some of the testimony, I'd like to read some of this testimony. It says, this is directly from the court transcript. It says, there was a man by the name of Colonel Michael Aquino. Michael Aquino was in the Army and had top Pentagon clearances. He also was a pedophile and a Satanist and founded the Temple of Set. He was a close friend and confidant of Anton Lavey, and they had a very active and sexual abuse of children. They deferred funding from many government programs to use in sexual experimentation in children. They split They were used to deliberately split the children into multiple personality disorders so that when the children were questioned or put under oath or used on a polygraph test, that unless the operator knows how to use to question and interrogate a multiple personality disorder, the operator of the polygraph turns up no evidence. They used kids to sexually compromise politicians and other people that they wanted to have control of. We have proof in black and white, and Lawrence King lost, and Paul Bonacci won $1 million in court. Huge victory. So that's really all I want to say about Michael Aquino. Obviously, this is not a good guy. I'd like to also talk a little bit about the Satanic Panic. The Satanic Panic was basically when all of these revelations were coming to light in the 1980s into 1990s. It tapered off in the early 1990s, but I like to say it was pushed under the rug because it's still going on. Do you really think it stopped? A lot of people became interested in the subject of Satanism and the Satanic Panic. And it was on mainstream news. Geraldo Rivera, talked about it, and it actually looked like it might come to light.
Whether a Satan exists is a matter of belief, but we are certain that Satanism exists. To some, it's a religion. To others, it's the practice of evil in the devil's name. It was here, parents and others allege, that as many as 60 young children were ritualistically abused by soldiers of Satan. What actually was done to the kids?
Oral copulation, sodomy, defecation, they were urinated on.
The former chief juvenile investigator at the Presidio, Ed Abanofsky, is here. He's now a deputy sheriff in Santa Clara County. Colonel Aquino, we note, sir, for the record, that you were originally implicated in the dreadful charges of child abuse. We note also that no charges were ever brought against you, and presumably you have been cleared. Would you like to comment on why those charges were brought against you?
Well, the entire time that the so-called child molestation scandal was occurring at the Presidio, the time period when these terrible events were supposedly taking place, I was assigned to the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and my wife was out there living with me.
But is it not a fact that a 3.5-year-old girl identified you as the alleged perpetrator of molestation?
No, as a matter of fact, it is not the case. An accusation was made by her stepfather, who was an Army chaplain, speaking on behalf of this child. In her original interview with the FBI, she denied ever being molested.
Well, I've seen you are innocent until proven guilty. You were never charged in this case. I don't want to belabor the point. I have seen, however, the affidavits for the search warrant of your home, and they indicate the child is speaking to the authorities, not her father.
This was after she had been subjected to therapy.
For one time in our history, it looked like gang stalking and mind control and Satanism and the connections to the Illuminati, it all might come out. But unfortunately, well, you know the story. So let me just give you a brief rundown of the Satanic Panic. In 1980, a documentary called Michelle Remembers, which was an account of basically in British Columbia, a sect of Satanists there was molesting and torturing a little girl. Michelle Smith, who the documentary was named after, obviously, recovered memories when she went to a therapist based on what had happened to her during that time. In 1982, somebody named Mary Barber, she discovered her daughter, or her grandchildren were being sexually abused by one of their parents, and her parent was named Mr. McQuan. She showed that they had been used in prostitution, tortured, and forced to allow animals to eat pet food out of their vaginas, etc. And obviously this came to light and was, a big public stir in 1982, and everyone was interested in this subject. Also in British Columbia, interestingly enough, at the same time, in Victoria, British Columbia, which is the same places where Michelle Smith recovered her memories, so there were some rumors spreading about the planned kidnapping of babies for sacrifices, human sacrifices. In 1983, Judy Johnson accused somebody named Mr. Buckley in Manhattan Beach, California, of sodomizing a 2-year-old pre-verbal sons in satanic rituals. So again, we go back to that Southern California area, interestingly enough. It's, also it seemed to be in Northern California, there was some stuff going on. I think the Zodiac Killer may have been there. But it was all in that section of California, interestingly enough. Nowhere else, was it so focused as in California, which conveniently was where Michael Aquino lived. In 1984, 208 criminal charges of child sexual abuse, including sexual abuse of children. 40 different children ended up being pressed against Ray Buckley, who ran the McMartin preschool in California, and 4 teachers who were all accused of sexually abusing children and had charges pressed against them. Again, in this section of California. It's just so damn disturbing. And also in 1984 in Miami, it was going around. Frank Fuster, was running a daycare and abusing children there as well. Allegations included Satanism, drinking urine, eating feces. Janet Reno was involved in that case, etc. So it was another case of child Satanism. Also in 1984, in Richmond, Virginia, allegations were made of, against a family who killed a child, and it was involved in a satanic ritual, which ended up becoming a huge news story in the day. In 1985, Sandra Craig is another one who operated a daycare operator, and she was accused of using a stick and a screwdriver to assault children, torturing animals, taking nude photographs, and she was ultimately sentenced to 10 years in prison. There was also allegations that she was involved in Satanism. James Rodriguez was also convicted of satanic sexual abuse of 2 young brothers. Some of the accusations levied against him included killing children, infanticide, and eating fetuses. In 1986, Mr. Watt goes on trial. Remember, he was the one who did the private daycare. 18 children actually testified against him of acts of Satanism. Defense lawyers, of course, argued that they were, basically used the False Memory Syndrome Foundation to try to discredit the children's stories, but it didn't work. In this case, Watt was sentenced to 165 years in prison. Again, they tried to trot out this False Memory Syndrome Foundation to allow it to discredit the children who were recovering these memories. Again, in 1986, in Carson City, daycare workers were accused of satanic abuse of 14 children. They talked about the children, testified to the murder of people, murders of children, murders of adults, ritual abuse, drinking blood, and other rituals in a satanic ceremony, again connected to Michael Aquino. 1987, Rockford, Illinois. We were in Rockford, Illinois. I was actually at Rockford, Illinois one time, and the perping was really it was like, when I was there, it was like, I'm not even going to get into it, honestly. But the son was accused of murdering his father in a satanic ritual, and actually another teenager, in an offer to the temple for Set, the Temple of Set. In 1989, in the Little Rascals daycare in North Carolina, it became one of the most famous cases of all, when several of the daycare's employees were charged with numerous counts of sexual abuse of children in connection to satanic rituals, including sexual molestation of children, electrodes on genitals, sexual mutilation, and the drinking of blood. So that's just a basic rundown of the history of the Satanic Panic in the United States. Cathy O'Brien is another prominent player in this. So if you do any research in ritual abuse, you're going to come across Cathy O'Brien and Kathleen Sullivan and others. Cathy O'Brien claims Senator Byrd was one of her many controllers. She was a presidential target. She claimed, for the highest levels of government. She claimed many senators sexually assaulted her, including President Clinton, Hillary Clinton. Many people sexually assaulted her, forced her to participate in brutal sexual activities. She uncovered numerous and revealed numerous obscure people, which was very, she had tons of information on lots of people involved in government and corporate interests and industry. She documented in precise detail how many people were involved in mind control prostitution, and she was also ritually abused and subjected to trauma-based mind control. So do some research on her. There's a lot of books that have been written about her, etc. So she's one person, you can take this video as like a hyperlink to go find more information for your own use. Another person to be aware of is Kathleen Sullivan. Interesting thing about Kathleen Sullivan is she was an intergenerational survivor. A lot of what they're interested in seems to be intergenerational abuse, abusing the mother and then abusing the child, abusing the grandparents, abusing the mother and the child. Keep the abuse in the bloodline, basically, is the idea there. A lot of things connected to the military with intergenerational abuse, intergenerational sexual abuse, intergenerational ritual abuse, satanic ritual abuse. I know a lot of it goes back to radiation experiments, human experimentees, mind control programming, etc. But she was interesting. Kathleen Sullivan was an intergenerational survivor. That's something interesting about her. She wrote a book called Unshackled, which is a survivor's story of mind control slavery. Kathleen Sullivan was a programmed assassin. She was also a sex slave. She was raped by Henry Kissinger, George Bush, and Billy Graham, and Robert Maxwell. And she was also subjected to satanic ritual abuse. She was also, one of her programmers and controllers was James Angleton, who was a Mossad asset and connected to the KGB. She was also, discussed Michael Aquino as well. Interestingly enough, she was the one who discusses the multimodal programming, which is the different levels of programming. She was the one who explained the alpha, beta, and theta levels of programming. Alpha programming is the programming which is typically the baseline programming. Alpha programming is the basis for all other programming. So basically, alpha programming is installed in targets and subjects before other programming. Alpha programming usually consists of the programming that, you will never remember this. It's the initial programming, it's the initial creating of the dissociative states and the alters, and it's the making them forget and installing of the triggers. Beta programming and it also can be used for other things as well. Alpha programming is just basic programming. Beta programming is programming usually involving sex slave programming, programming involving high-level assassinations, things like that. Manchurian candidate programming is higher level programming, which is beta programming, which usually involves alters embedded within alters. Theta programming is not so much programming as it is developing abilities within alters. Theta programming is once you have high-level alters from beta programming, developing certain abilities. So if you know anything about the Project Stargaze program, there was something called remote viewing that was being experimented on. A lot of people believe that alters could be programmed to be able to do remote viewing. But even more so, a lot of the alters in beta programming were Basically, it comes down to, memorizing documents, taking pictures with your brain, etc., and being able to recover those later. So basically superhuman abilities. So that's it for Kathleen Sullivan. Let's talk about Ted Gunderson. Ted Gunderson, as we talked about, he was an investigator, an FBI investigator. He was the one who interviewed Paul Bonacci. Ted Gunderson was with the FBI. He was a special agent in charge, and he was the head of the LA FBI. He also handled Marilyn Monroe and JFK cases. And by the way, just for your knowledge, there was a lot of allegations that Marilyn Monroe was actually a beta program slave. He investigated the trials in the Manhattan Beach, California thing, which we talked about above in the history of Satanism, basically, in the history of the Satanic Panic, where I talked about the Manhattan Beach satanic ritual abuse. Ted Gunderson warned about the proliferation of secret satanic groups. He also revealed that there were slave auctions in which many children that were mind control slaves were being sold to people from other countries, basically, and sold into child sex slavery, and they were being held in Las Vegas. He said that every year, 4,000 human sacrifices are performed in New York City, and he also believed that Gunderson was one of the few FBI people that revealed that there was a secret network in the United States of groups which kidnap children and infants and subject these people to satanic ritual abuse and human sacrifice. So he was a core critical person. He is now dead, of course, and no longer with the FBI, obviously, and basically was discredited by the system. Finally, two more people. Fritz Springmeier, he wrote the Illuminati formula used to control an undetectable total mind-controlled slave. Again, let me read that again. That's a great book. The Illuminati formula used to create an undetectable total mind-controlled slave. I highly recommend you read this. He wrote a lot on Illuminati crime families. I know recently he was just released from prison. He was set up like about 10 years ago by the FBI in a bombing of some sort. They claim that he was trying to bomb daycare centers or something. I forget the specifics, but I know he was recently released from prison. And he's written many books on the Illuminati. And I believe that he's also been on Alex Jones' show and those kinds of things. Finally, there's General Valalee. General Valalee was the commander of the 7th Psychological Operations Group in Presidio. Interestingly enough, where the Presidio Daycare Center is, and also where Michael Aquino was. He wrote a paper called From PSYOP to Mind War, The Psychological Victory with Michael Aquino. He co-authored the Mind War paper with, it's commonly called the Mind War paper. He co-authored it with Michael Aquino. He also co-authored a paper called The New Mental Battlefield, Beam Me Up Spock, where he talks about how we need to use these kind of techniques on the American people to program the American people to defeat the Soviet Union. He basically talked about how there were, he said that there are pure natural conditions under which minds become more or less receptive to ideas, and mind war should take advantage of these phenomena such as atmospheric activity, air ionization such as HAARP, and low frequency waves. So that's General Valalee. I know this has been a long video, and I hope you found it informative. For people who believe that they are subjects of ritual abuse, mind control programming, and high-level programming, and are gang-stalked, I would highly recommend that you try to find a good therapist. I would recommend that you read up on the survivorship.org organization. Survivorship.org is an organization which provides basically help to people who are survivors of satanic ritual abuse and mind control slavery. I would also encourage you to look up and read a book called An American Gulag by Alexia Parks, who talks about children who are forced basically by their parents into basically abuse camps and reprogramming camps under a umbrella program called Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs, called WASPs. And she does a lot of activism and stuff, which is great. So I encourage you to get involved with her and look her up because she has a lot of resources on her site. She runs an organization called Teen Liberty. So any children that are going through this, I strongly, if you don't want to get into all the Satanism stuff, just read up on Alexia Parks and an American Gulag. It's like a 3-hour, 4-hour read. It's an easy read book, but you'll learn a lot about these techniques because a lot of the techniques that are done here are also used by these reprogramming camps. And also, and always remember, when you get in contact with these organizations, be very, very careful. There's perps everywhere. These people will kill you. They can induce suicide programming on you. Your controllers can reveal what's going on. So you need to be very careful. I'm sure you all understand now that this is the same system that relates to gang stalking. It's many gang stalking targets are perped by people that have undergone satanic ritual abuse. Satanism, a lot of it goes on to controlling other people, perping people, which is involved in gang stalking. So it obviously has a lot to do with gang stalking. Gang stalking is obviously just one other face of this many-sided coin of shitty and shady things that go on in this country and the world. So gang stalking is used to discredit people like this. It's used to discredit therapists who try to help people expose ritual abuse. It's used to carry out mass shootings. Ritual abuse is used to program people to carry out mass shootings. Which is used to discredit targets. So, this is a very nasty, sinister kind of thing. So, I recommend that you get involved with this and learn about this at your own risk. A lot of this material is very disturbing, and but we need to increase public awareness and expose this. So if you think that you've been a subject of this, I highly recommend you look up Kathleen Sullivan. I would also encourage you to look up in 1991 a video of, it's the Presidential Commission, where President Clinton apologizes for human experimentation. There's a committee where survivors, in Washington, D.C., where survivors of this kind of programming and gang stalking and intimidation are testifying to it. And see if your experiences relate to that. I would encourage you to look up the Extreme Abuse Survey, which is called the Extreme Abuse Survey for Survivors. And it's a survey that was conducted among thousands of survivors of programming, and see if your experiences are... it also has in there, not only about that, it says personal experiences of extreme abuse, how you recover it, things about altars. Strangely enough, a lot of perpetrators, one of the perpetrators went by the name Dr. Black, Dr. Green, Dr. White, Dr. Shorts, Father Joseph. You've watched people be flayed, etc. So there's a lot of specifics in here that may help you recover memories that would be very helpful. So I encourage you to look them up. They have a ton of stuff in here, various healing methods. They talk in the Extreme Abuse Survey, acupuncture, aromatherapy for homeopathy, a lot of stuff. Not that I'm recommending any of this stuff. I'm just saying that people have tried. So I'd encourage you to look at that and see how much help it was. It is whether it was a great help, much help, some help, little help, or no help. So it's a good resource. So the category, most of it's ritual abuse, mind control, ritual abuse and mind control, etc. So you can look at the Extreme Abuse Survey. I also encourage you to look at Gordon Hammond's Green Bomb speech. Look up at the Los Angeles County Commission for Women, the report on the Ritual Abuse Task Force. Look at the drawings of programming victims. You can search for those, and they're very disturbing. You can see the Advocacy Committee for Human Experimentation Survivors and Mind Control, and also look up Colin Ross, who wrote an article called Building the Manchurian Candidate. And I also have some other ones for you to look up. Look up Masonic ritual abuse information, which is home.aol.com/smartnews. The Mind Control Forum, members.gnn.com/5string. The advisory, and also look up AICS-MC, the Advisory Committee for Human Experimentation Survivors. So, I hope this information has been useful to you. I hope you've learned a lot about gang stalking and ritual abuse and mind control and how they relate to a lot of nasty, sinister, and devious things. And I hope this will be informative to you, and I hope you will spread the word and we can expose these people. And as always, good luck.